Welcome everyone to our first episode of Conversations from the Classroom, and I'm joined here by Dr. Elaine Mahon, and Elaine is going to talk to us a little bit about inclusion and interreligious dialogue, and I suppose the diversity from the lived reality in the classroom. So just on that note, would you like to introduce yourself, Elaine, just so the students know who you're listening to?
Yeah, great. I forgot I had a doctorate. So my kids just call me Miss Mahon in school. So yeah, I'm a primary school teacher. I spent about 10 years outside the classroom working kind of in different roles in the area of religious education. I worked on Grow and Love and a few other bits and pieces, but back now in the classroom where I belong. So I teach in an all boys primary school. I teach 6th class at the moment. I've tend to been in the senior end of the primary school, so my speciality is kind of 3rd to 6th. And yeah, 28 great boys this year, and a nice diverse mix. I spent the first part of my career I spent teaching in a Dash 1 Band 1 school, and that had lots of opportunities and lots of challenges, but diversity wasn't really one of them. Most of our kids were kind of were Catholic anyway, in religious background. The school that I'm teaching in now for the last few years, it's quite a diverse school. We have about a third of our population, of our school population, aren't Catholic. And so it's been interesting for me, even transitioning, kind of knowing the theory of kind of inclusion, particularly in religious education, and then kind of living it out then and putting into practice those things that I preached. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. So it's good. It's nice, good challenge.
It is. That's a big shift from the school types even. Was it just even the type of diversity you're saying? And I suppose, like, I flagged with the students previously as well, you know, and I know you outlined it really brilliantly in the segment of the booklet. Just so everyone knows, was Elaine done an awful lot of the research that's involved in the sharing best practice on inclusion booklet by the CSP that I have up on loop for you to read. But even in that section that Elaine has contributed to in it, she highlights that inclusion isn't just something about religion either. You know, it's not. We tend to narrow the focus on inclusion sometimes in our rhetoric and talking about inclusion to be something just specifically about religious identity and cultural identity. But as you're saying there, you were in a Daesh school. Also, prior to that, there was another wider bracket of inclusion going on there, even within the school, and different demands, I'd imagine.
Yeah, totally.
In that initial school. Do you want to say that?
I find as well, you know, even in terms of different special needs, just in terms of difference, there's so much to do with inclusion. So children who are on ASD spectrum, you know, I have a boy in my class this year who has Down syndrome, and, you know, ensuring his full inclusion in everything that we do. Again, also in religious education, but not just in that, making the boys aware. It's interesting when you come from a Dash 1 school and you live in kind of that situation of poverty and disadvantage and intergenerational unemployment, and then you come to a more middle class school, just even raising the consciousness of my boys that, you know, there are children living 15 miles away who literally don't have enough to eat today. So yeah, kind of broadening that out of, just as you say, we can maybe be too hard on ourselves in terms of religious education and say, oh, we've, you know, such a long way to go in terms of including kids of different faiths, but it's really of heightening awareness for all of our kids about all the difference that's out there.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, because, so like you're saying, it's not just in RE and it's the wider curriculum as well, but I think it's also that kind of the context as well. It's a Catholic school you're working in, so we're back again to the Catholic ethos and what's it mean across the whole curriculum and how we actually be in the school and interact with each other and accommodate that difference and engage with that diversity. Because, you know, coming from that Christian perspective and that Catholic perspective, inclusion really is, you know, a central tenement of Catholicism. It's for, you know, salvation for all. Yeah. All of us are created in the image and likeness of God, that innate dignity of the human person, and that I suppose I'd always thought that was an interesting aspect. I remember in CPSMA, before a query coming in about a student, actually, I might have actually said this before. But a student, they were probably having an issue with a student in school, and they were looking at disciplinary action. So whether about expelling the child or what are we going to do with the child that had been a repeat offender, let's say. Yeah. So it was a very challenging situation. And the actual principal asked one of the representatives of CPSMA, but how can I approach this from the ethos of my school? Where's the element of mercy?
That's it.
So where's the element of mercy? And for me, it was kind of one of those things, because we tend to think about ethos, this kind of, arbitrary, abstract concept, kind of way that's aspirational and kind of superimposed on what I do as teacher, let's say. But it was one of those real examples of the practicalities of ethos as something that's really actually lived out in the school. I think that kind of manifests itself in RE, yeah.
Totally. And it's one of the, I'd use the ethos daily with my boys. And again, I have 28 boys and 8 of them aren't Catholic, and 6 of them aren't Christian. So it's, I would still use it with them, with all of my boys. Well, we're in a Catholic school, and how would Jesus want us to respond to this situation? And you'd use that as kind of a collective for the class, not include those boys who aren't Christian, but to be really confident about who we are, and then how we should act out of that. Like the discipline one is really interesting, because there's an argument that in a Catholic school, exclusion or expulsion should never be on the menu, because nobody is beyond redemption. And again, like we'd use that in the class a lot, about forgiveness, about understanding, about saying sorry. I say sorry a lot in my classroom. I'm sorry that I freaked out that you didn't have your homework done for the 15th day in a row. Can you see how that's really frustrating for me? But I, shouldn't have got quite so upset about it. So, let's agree to start again, or whatever it is. And I think modeling those kind of principles for our kids, and admitting that we make mistakes and that we find things difficult as well, particularly in this kind of COVID thing. I'd come in and I'd say to the boys, I'm having a tough day now. I'm dealing with all of this level 5 stuff, and I didn't have my coffee. And they'd be encouraging me to go to the staff room to relax for a minute and then to come back. And I think all that is ethos, all that is kindness, all that is generosity, all that is understanding. And I would explain it to them in those terms.
Yeah, it's always very human, isn't it? Like it's all about being a person, really.
Yeah.
And I suppose I think would you find, like, just even setting the scene in your school, like you're saying there, right? You're in a Catholic school, right? There's a third of the school community, you're saying, are non-Catholic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that's a significant portion, like within it, like what would be traditionally considered like a Catholic school being all, the traditional kind of classroom, all Catholics in the class, all this kind of story. Yeah. But I think even that human dimension is really important. I'd imagine, in the way you address inclusion, is in that you're dealing with the person rather than, so you're starting first with the person and kind of moving out.
Exactly.
So like
and it's one of the things that I think we've been slow to do, is just like to recognize difference, to recognize that these boys come from a different religious tradition. But I always frame that in the context that we are all different. So I have green eyes, you have brown eyes, you believe in ghosts, I don't. You believe this, I believe that, and it just so happens that Muhammad believes this and I believe that. So I think making that very obvious and explicit, and again using examples of people's different learning styles, or of their kind of learning differences. You'd say, well, some of us find it difficult to concentrate, some of us find schoolwork really easy, and just humanizing it, that we're all different, and our religious difference is just one aspect of our difference, because there's a million ways in which we're different, and being confident enough to name religious difference as being among those differences. I remember when I used to be a diocesan advisor in Dublin, and when our job is to visit schools and kind of support teachers to teach religious education, and when I come into the classroom, the teacher, often genuinely trying to be sensitive, would whisper to me in Irish the names of the children who weren't Catholic, just to give me the heads up, so that I wouldn't be embarrassed and they wouldn't be embarrassed. And I would always make a point of introducing myself and to say, I understand that some of you aren't Catholic or aren't Christian, but, I welcome you to take part in this conversation as well. And again, I think, when you have a class, perhaps particularly where I teach, in fairness, in the senior end of things, I would always have a conversation with my kids, privately as well as publicly, about their religious beliefs. So I found some of the kids that I teach are almost evangelical about their faith. So I've had some Muslim kids who are really happy to share, this is what we do, let me teach you some Arabic. They bring in their prayer mat for us, they bring in their Quran, they show us where to put it up high above all the other books when they're storing it, all of these things, and that's wonderful. I've had other kids in my class who are Muslim who really do not want to talk about their difference. And I leave that at that. That is perfectly acceptable. So I think, yeah, it's about dealing with humans on whatever level they're at. Similarly, like I have Catholic boys who don't want to talk about God either. You know, and I have Catholic boys who don't go to mass. That's the vast majority of them. And so really, they don't actually have a whole lot of religious experience to share with me. And similarly, just because, like, I have a Hindu boy, you know, this year, and, you know, I said to him, you know, maybe around Diwali we do something. He's like, do what? I didn't have a clue. So, you know, there's no perfect recipe for, you're dealing with, you know, whoever is there in front of you and including them to whatever extent that they're happy to be included. So it's a tricky one, but again, it's only tricky, I think, if we don't approach it kind of confidently, knowing ourselves, you know, this is something that I can deal with. And this is not something that I need to be afraid of. And again, we're modeling that for our kids, you know, that this is something I'm going to approach openly, and I'm probably going to make a mistake and pronounce something, you know, incorrectly, or I'm going to suggest something to you about your religious tradition and you're going to tell me I'm wrong, and that's okay because I'm going to learn. So yeah, I think the openness is so important, just not to be afraid of it.
That's brilliant, because that's even I think you're really getting interesting one there when you're saying about like having the confidence to recognize difference, like, because like you can't have inclusion without a recognition of difference. Otherwise, what are you including, or what are you trying to accommodate? You know, and what are you trying to facilitate or nurture in the class? Or you're not really even giving individuals the respect, you know, and their own agency and autonomy of where they're at. But even, have you found like that it's really interesting that the way the dynamic you've suggested there about, you know, having a private conversation and a public, and, you know, maybe a classroom wide conversation. But I think it's a really interesting point there was about, you know, when you came in as a DA, so you got that kind of the whisper in, you know, that hush hush kind of, which is interesting, because I actually shared the figures with students about, you know, that study that was done in the Archdiocese of Dublin around 2006. You know, that about 92 across 92 schools there was 108 nationalities, I think, and 28 different religions present in the school. But yet you could see that there was an instance of your experience going into a school where, you know, there was non-Catholics there. It was, and how it was being dealt with wouldn't have been necessarily the way you would have approached it. But I suppose in the school, like in your school now, is there a particular policy or anything in place around RE and inclusion, or in your school? Because I know, like, the local.
Yeah, there is, but you know, like, policies are great. They're great, and they sit lovely on shelves. They hold books up, and they do all kinds of great things. But again, each teacher has to take the policy and say, you know, what does this actually mean for me in my classroom? And again, how confident am I to do that? So policies, again, like they're really set out maybe the gold standard, what we really want to do, but they have to be accompanied then by people who are going to journey with everybody to kind of bring them to where that is. So we do have a policy, I do have a policy document, and again, there would be one on inclusion, and then there'd be one on religious education, and then somewhere within the religious education one, there would be, you know, a part on inclusion. It's one of the things, you know, that can be difficult to say around Grow in Love. So Grow in Love, where it does look at different religions, it really focuses on the monotheistic religions, as the curriculum does really focus on the monotheistic religions. So I think even in terms of, so you can go so far and kind of recognizing, and that's really where our policies would focus on, kind of recognizing difference, respecting difference. Perhaps though we need to go a little step further just in terms of educating, so that our kids can understand a little bit more. We don't want to, you know, overdo that, and perhaps there's an argument that that's where post-primary comes in. But I think it's one of the things that maybe is lacking, is educating into, or educating about, at least, those kind of differences that we see around us. So that's one of the things that probably isn't in our policy framework. And, I just query whether or not we could perhaps be doing a little bit more of it.
Brilliant, and that's a good point on policy. I think it's also interesting there just to unpack that for the students as well. When you're speaking of monotheistic faiths, you're talking about belief in one God, religion is to believe in one, and particularly within the curriculum, we're talking about the Abrahamic faiths. So you're talking about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and that's the key ones there. So Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, any of these other, I think they're not part and parcel with the curriculum.
That's it. And I think they're really important, and I mean the census would tell us this, right? Like a really important large cohort at the moment is the nuns, not the NUN, the NONE. So like I've a lot of the NONEs in my class, and
really,
yeah, and how that. So these kids, I have a couple of kids who weren't baptized, but I've two really great, interesting, intelligent boys who are baptized. So I have confirmation class, and I had this class last year as well, and who in 5th class said to me, I'm not going to be making my confirmation next year. And my instinct was to say, yes, you are. But I didn't. And I said, what every good teacher says, to give myself some time to kind of formulate an articulate response. And, I surprised that. And they came to me separately at different times, and I don't think one knew the other was talking to me about it. And they were just, I just don't believe any of it, and I've never been to church, and one of them I know said to me, we don't even go Christmas or anything. Like we don't have anything.
Yeah.
I just don't see the point, in doing this thing. And again, so I have another 2 boys who aren't baptized or anything. And just to acknowledge that as well, that they don't have a faith tradition. And again, that's okay. That's actually a trickier one for me. And one that I have to just be careful around and not insinuate that that they're lacking something because they don't have a faith tradition. But to acknowledge it. So where I've done it maybe more successfully, I won't tell you all the bad examples, but where I've done it more successfully is around Christmas. So I'd be keen to get them to tell us how they celebrate Christmas in a non-religious way, which isn't actually very different to how the rest of them celebrate Christmas, except they probably might throw in a crib or mass. But I'd say so for you for you, Christmas isn't, a celebration of the birth of Jesus. So how is it a celebration? And it's, all the usual presents and, everything else.
Time for family and
exactly. So it's harder for me, and maybe it's just something I haven't practiced enough, but I find it a little bit more difficult to kind of include those boys in religious education and in the framework of belief, that non-belief is part of that,
And do you find it challenging because you're coming from a faith perspective yourself, or do you find it just that the program? Do you find it yourself, or do you find it the program, or is it a combination of the two? Is it a?
No, I find the program helpful. I find Grow in Love helpful in that it's a program based on experience, right? So like certainly some parts in every lesson, every child will be able to tune in. So at the end of last year, even though it was online because we were COVID, I asked my boys about their best memory from a variety of subject areas. And one of them was religious education. What's your best memory? And they talked about the most random, the parable of the workers in the vineyard, right? Came up. Because we had done this drama around the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And every single boy took part because it was just a story. It happened to be a story that Jesus told, but it could have been any story. And so in the parable, there's a number of groups of workers, and very basically, they all get paid the same amount, even though they all do different levels of work. And my boys got really into this lesson. And was this just? Was this fair? If you do more work, should you not get more money? And I suppose what Jesus was trying to teach was that, like, God is generous to everybody, and more maybe comprehensively that those who are first shall be last, and those who are last shall be first. But all of my boys took part in that, and they all had that sense of justice for the guys who had worked longer, and the desire to be generous. So that was a very basic foundation of justice, which all of my boys had, regardless of their religious tradition or none. So in that way, everybody could get involved, and the program, in fact, facilitated everybody's involvement in it. It's just the next part then. So when I'm taking a religious meaning out of that, can I help my boys who don't have a faith tradition to still take a meaning out of it about generosity and fairness? So again, I've given you a good example of where they did that for themselves. They said, well, maybe in my life I can be more generous, more fair, more just, whatever, without reference to a religious or faith tradition. So again, that was a good example of where the program helped me do that. But that's not going to be possible. Like if you're doing a lesson on baptism, what are you going to do?
Yeah, of course. And I suppose that's the interesting thing you flagged there. Like all your students participated in the so like I flagged with the students before the whole learning about, learning into, learning from, that those three dynamics, so it's the three stools there as regards that are operating within Catholic RE. But I suppose, have you had any students completely opt out, like you have a third of the students in your school are non-Catholic? Have you experienced any students who are be it different religions or none, have their parents explicitly said, I don't want them to take part in the class? And even in that situation, have you found it hard to carry out the lesson without really trying not to exclude the others, that student explicitly, but also then maybe I've often had situations I heard about where the student who was supposed to opt out was nearly the most enthusiastic about the lesson, and you're trying to marriage that. I suppose taken for granted, like I flagged with students already, taken for granted that even if someone does opt out of RE, they can't opt out of the ethos of the school, so they're still going to encounter religion in some capacity. But within that RE class, like, so you had a class there where you had all the students partake and also from different faiths. And this question I'd like to address even again in a second. Do you have any other Christian denominations in your class? And how does that work? But just even then, just in a general sense, have you had any bad experience, good experiences, and what would you suggest?
So I've never had a child, and I understand this happens. I just personally have never had a parent or a child come to me and say, I don't want them doing anything. Generally, again, in the senior end of the primary school. So again, you're introducing this in terms of the ethos of your class, which I've already set out. I'd be very open about difference. I'd always have had, like within the first week, a conversation with these boys. And we come to an understanding very early on. So I would always say to them, if there's something we're discussing or whatever, you're always welcome to take part. And I would always say, if you're not comfortable to take part or even to listen, what would you do at that stage? So again, senior primary school, 3rd to 6th, they'd say, I read my book, I draw, I'd whatever. So I would always give them that option. And sometimes when I say, okay, we're gonna do our grow and love, I notice them because it's of interest to me, and they'll sit and wait, and they'll see how religious this lesson is going to be. And if I start by saying, in the church we believe, they'll just take their book out. But if I say, well, today we're going to talk about what's fair and what's just and what's generous, they'll sit and listen for a while. So again, when you're operating out of a classroom ethos that is welcoming and open and inclusive, and I'm not suggesting I do it right all the time, because I don't, and I've, put my foot in it loads of times, but where you're operating out of that, even when you put your foot in it, they forgive you, because they know that you're just trying to be inclusive, and you're trying to be supportive of where they are, and trying to, to have them involved as much as they're, happy and able to. So I can think of this one example where this boy in my class in my old school, and I loved the bones of him, he was just great, Muslim, boy, and on more than one occasion I would ask my class, again all Catholic at that stage, apart from him one year, and I'd say, you know, how many gospels are there, and his would be the first hand up, and this kind of became a joke between he and I. And you know, after class I'd say to him, can you believe that the Muslim boy was the only boy with his hand up when I asked for the 4 gospels? And he'd be like, miss, you got to teach these guys better, you know, like they don't know anything, you know. How would they ever learn the Quran, you know? So I remember another time being in, and you talked about Christian denominations. I remember being in a school, an extremely diverse school. I think at the time priced itself at being one of the most diverse schools in kind of one of these new areas in Dublin. And I said to the class talking, it was a confirmation class, I said, you know, where would we find the story of Pentecost? And one of the boys put up his hands and he says, you know, miss, it's in the book of Acts, chapter this, verse this. And one of the other boys, Catholic boys, turned to the person beside him and said, he's stupid, it's in the Bible. But this was a Christian class who knew book, verse, and chapter. And the Catholic kids were like, what's he talking about? The book of Acts, it's in the Bible. You know, so again, we can't, you know, presume anything by virtue of the kids that are, you know, are there in front of us. But yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it is. I suppose. Have you found, let's say, other Christian denominations be able to take part in certain aspects of the program, Joe? And so really, you're talking really when it comes to sacramental prep. I think, Joe, you're talking the real key differences emerge, really.
It is. And that's really, like I said to you a minute ago, those are all good examples. Like I do have confirmation class this year. There's things that we can do. Like, for example, my boys have this confirmation workbook that they do, a journal or whatever. So at the start of the year, I photocopy the book. That's probably against copyright, so I'm not promoting that. But anyway,
that's all right. I can edit that out.
I photocopy those parts of the book that I'm allowed to, and that don't have a religious connotation in them, so where they're just talking about their family or their friends or whatever. So that means that, so when I introduce that, I'd say, okay, we'll take out our journals. So I don't specify that it's a confirmation journal, and we all take out our journal, whatever it is. But obviously then we do come to those parts that are explicitly Catholic, and we have to own that as well, because that's who we are, and that's who these boys are. And we want to be careful, like, that we're not being so mad into include everybody, that we're not being true to the fact that part of our role, whether we like it or not, as primary school teachers in Catholic schools, is to form these baptized children in their faith. And frankly, for a lot of my kids, if they're not being formed in their faith by their teacher, I don't know where they're being formed in their faith, and if they're being formed in their faith. So
I think that's common across. I think that's a common situation now. You'll find that an awful lot of students, their first encounter with church, let's say, is nearly in school.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you know, what a wonderful way to experience church, you know, as well, you know. But in another way, it also puts that extra, I suppose, the importance again on the teacher's voice and on the making sure that they're providing accurate information too.
Yeah.
And that it also puts pressure on the teacher too, in the sense of that if this is their, I suppose, their primary or principal engagement with church, how in which you address issues and address things is you're making the impression on them, you're imparting yourself on them as being church, what church is, you know. So it's like that, leading by example.
Yeah. And you know, it happens as well that the boys will always and again, when we talk about inclusion, boys from every faith tradition and none will ask you questions about how the church is exclusive.
Yeah.
So they'll pick me up when we're doing the sacrament of holy orders. I've never not been picked up on the fact that it doesn't apply to women. In every class ever taught, when we're talking about holy orders, somebody puts their hand up and says, hold on a second. Like, why again isn't that open to women? I also have in my old school had a situation where the 6th class child making confirmation, and her auntie had got married a couple of weeks before to her other auntie. So her auntie was gay, and this kid coming up to me with the genuine not attention seeking, not anything, because we had known about the auntie getting married. We had prayed for the auntie getting married, all of this. But hold on a second here now, because I'm a bit confused by this. She thought the wedding was going to be in a church. And I didn't know that you're not allowed to get married in the church if you're marrying a woman. So, and that's really, really hard. So it's,
I suppose they're hard because they're the big questions for mature adult Catholics as well.
Absolutely.
You know, like, so, like, you know, and there is the irony as well within the church of the fact of how exclusive it is in terms of women as well, considering how fundamental women were in the actual emergence of Christianity and the leadership roles they had there. Like, Joy, it really is, I suppose in some ways it's an opportunity to nearly distinguish between faith in Christ and the role of teaching. I suppose the role of Catholic teaching as opposed to
and even today, my mother and her female friends run the parish. The priest just comes in and out.
Yeah,
they do everything else, you know. So I'd always be keen to kind of say that to my boys as well, or to my kids, you know, that like,
well, like, if you were to even take it, Elaine, like, if you
have other roles.
Well, if you take it, like, even like the way I looked at it, even myself in my prior roles, even working with the Catholic education bodies, you know, apart from, let's say, the bishops themselves, I was surrounded, the vast majority of people I was surrounded with were women. And, you know, strong, powerful, you know, leaders, you know. Was it? And like, that's something like, you know, like, again, we're the most exclusive, inclusive space in the world in some ways. In that way,
there's women like, you know, Nano Nagel, Catherine McCauley, who built systems, you know, so
built Catholic education system. These are massive figures. And I suppose even when you're talking about that, even when we talk about different schools, like the inclusion aspect as well, like the diversity that's even within Catholicism as well, and, you know, and then even we talk about the diversity within Christianity. And I suppose if there's one takeaway, I think, even from our conversation today, it's that, I suppose, you know, diversity, of course, it's all around you, but you have to kind of name it.
Yeah.
You have to name it, and you have to address it, and it's the manner in which you address it that's important.
Yeah.
And I suppose just even one last thing I never got to ask you, actually, Elaine, was, Joe, when it comes to the sacraments and, Joe, them making their confirmation or that, is there any, like, do you provide any opportunities for students of other faiths and none to get involved in some way with the student, apart from the journals, let's say, but like, you know, to celebrate the day with their classmates or anything? Or, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important. Again, like, I don't assume that they want to do that. So again, it's, you know, be time for a chat, you know, and to see what they want to do. So I'm not a big believer in going to the church for 792 practices and all of that kind of stuff. So, you know, we limit that kind of, you know, showiness. It's not necessary for every kid to have a job. And that makes, you know, around the practicalities, it makes it a little bit kind of easier. I think in a day when we were all traipsing to the church, you know, every day for 2 weeks, I think that was really difficult on some of the kids. We don't do that anymore, so that's one blessing. But then in terms of the day itself, like, I would always invite them to come. But again, I would usually have a private conversation about it. You know, I'd say, look, you know, we have confirmation tomorrow. Would you like to come? If they say yes, I always say, we need to chat to mum and dad about that, and just make sure they're happy for you to come. And largely they will be, and they come and they sit at the back. I have some kids who say, no, I don't want to go. And I say, totally perfect. You know, the next day when the kids come in, we'll be having a little party. They'll be wearing their clothes. Would you like to just wear your civvies that day? You don't have to wear your uniform if you don't want to. And, you know, generally they really appreciate things like that. And even where they say, no, I just prefer to wear my uniform, I do think they appreciate that you're kind of looking out for them anyway. But again, that only works if you've built the relationship of inclusion. So if all year you've been kind of whispering, you know, he doesn't do religion, and then you suddenly come down to them and say, do you want to come to confirmation? They'll be like, no, like, why would I want to come to confirmation? Like, and they can react defensively, you know. So you have to have kind of build that from the start. And then, as I said, when you know, make mistakes or say something wrong, or, you know, say something that they don't believe in, they forgive you for it. So like, if Jehovah's Witness in my class this year, boy is a Seventh-day Adventist as well, and I know that I often say things that they I don't know if they personally disapprove of, but certainly that there will be a different perspective to their own given faith tradition. And sometimes they take me up on it. And, you know, where they do take me up on it then, and they're happy too, it's a really good opportunity for me to say, well, I didn't know that. You know, will you tell me more about how you interpret the story of creation? And yeah,
that's brilliant. Though. You see, but I think what's really coming across massively here, Elaine, though, is number one, your humility, as teacher, even in that space, like that you're able to acknowledge even when I don't know that, so you don't have to be the all-knowing, like nobody knows everything.
Yeah.
But also I think the fact that you recognize the difference. And you said, right, this is another dynamic relationship that I have to try and cultivate, and nurture in the class. And it seems like you really sprung off of the invitational character of the Catholic faith in general, but also Catholic religious education and the Catholic ethos school. Everyone's invited to participate, but obviously, the really thing that you really seem to have captured really well is the agency and autonomy of the student themselves to make, it's so. I think even just to flag it there, because it's the big elephant in the room always, and the students always every year, first years come in, I get into the same thing in the lecture hall, and it's I asked them, how many of you went to a Catholic primary school? How many of you went to a Catholic secondary school? How many of you went to a Catholic third level? Let's say institute. Some might have, some might not. So how many of you go to mass every day? How many of you contemplate joining the seminary? How many contemplate becoming a nun? So how many of you does faith fundamentally impact the very daily existence of your lives? So, well, either Catholic schools are really, really bad at indoctrination, right? Or it's just something that they're not about, And I think that's the real thing.
Yeah, it's a great exercise.
Because like you're seeing it there, and there's nothing, and we live in a pluralist society. So we live in and that means that you're supposed to be able to present yourself. And you form your identity, from your relationship with others around you and different perspectives and worldviews. So in that space too, of course, it's really important, like you said, to present. So there's things that are actually uniquely and distinctly Catholic, that are part and parcel with the identity of that school, with the type of education that you're delivering in that school, and with the ethos and approach taken to religious education in that classroom. So there's certain things that are presented as such, but that doesn't mean that it can't be still inclusive. That people can't engage with that truth from different angles, because it's not about worrying about even causing offense all the time. Really, what you're trying to do, I think, isn't it, in your class, is if we're doing religious education, I want students who are going to participate in this to get as much out of it as they can.
That's it.
For themselves in their own lives. And I think, I'd love to be in your class, to be honest.
Oh, I don't know. I might just say, just as you were talking there, it struck me something that I didn't say. Like I say from day one. So I tell them on the first day my name is Elaine, and they were like, I know the teacher's first name. I said, Elaine. I have 2 children. John is 5, Hannah's 2. I live with my husband. We live in a bungalow in the middle of the country, and I'm Catholic. So that means that I pray every day. I usually pray in the car on the way to school. I go to mass every Sunday. We have a turtle and 2 fish. So I present my own faith. Now, I'm happy to do that. I also, when we do science, I also say to them, boys, I don't have a scientific mind. So you're going to help me when we're doing these experiments to try to help me figure things out. So I declare, I'm brutal at PE as well. Brutal. I just throw a ball in and hope for the best. So, but when it comes to religion, they know my faith perspective and they're comfortable with that. So when we say our prayers in the mornings, which we do every morning, we bless ourselves, and I say, what will we pray for today? Generally, the Christian boys are standing, the non-Christian boys are sitting, generally. But every day, not some days, every day, one of the boys who is sitting will put their hand up. And they're generally just telling you their news. So the boys who are standing, they'd say, I want to pray for my dad, he's sick today. Perfect. This boy is sitting down, so choosing not to take part in the prayer, puts his hand up. My granny is sick too. So I take the prayer. And I say, well, I'm going to pray for your granny because she's sick. So yeah, anyway, they know my faith perspective as well. I'm comfortable to share my faith with them. I tell them when, you know, this is difficult for me to believe, to understand, whatever it is. So yeah, it's just about as much openness, you know, in all things. I think that's the essence of good education, but it's definitely the essence of good Catholic education.
Yeah, that's a brave thing to do as well. You know, that you're opening yourself. I'd imagine, like, at first, a teacher newly qualified out would struggle with that massively. Was it, you know, to just come out straight away and into that space? But I think that, again, like, it's like faith itself. It's something that develops and goes through a process of self-knowledge. You know, itself. You know,
we demand. Like, I have to laugh at my son. Like, he comes home. First of all, he tells the teacher everything. I get away with nothing. Like, oh, I told Miss So you were in bad mood this morning. I'm like, great, you know, thanks. But we demand an awful lot of personal information from our students. Like, we ask them all the time personal questions in religion, in SPHE. We're asking them in SPHE, like, when do you feel confident? When do you feel scared? Who are the members of your family you argue with? Like, I believe strongly that if we're not sharing some of ourselves, of course we maintain a personal boundary. But if we're not sharing some of ourselves, I don't know how we can get these kids to authentically give of themselves. And it's about, like, good Catholic, good education again, but good Catholic education is about holistic education. So everything, their whole person is being educated, not just their brain. So asking them how they feel about things, telling them how you feel about things. I accept what you say. Maybe it's difficult for a first-year teacher, and it obviously depends on your disposition and everything like that. But, you know, I think back to the Parker Palmer cliche of, you teach who you are. And if you're going to be, you know, I will not smile until Christmas, it's tough. I just think.
I'll tell you what, like, and I have to say I'm the same. Even when I'm teaching, I just can't not be. It feels like I'm wearing somebody else's clothes if I'm not. And of course, enough you uphold the professional dimension, of course. But I think all good relationship has a certain level of vulnerability in it as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, and just a flag, even like what you're saying there. It's not just about knowledge, religious knowledge and purely intellectual, but the old analogy, the head, heart, and hands.
That's it.
And this kind of that whole aspect of things. But I suppose is there anything else you'd like to add? Because, like, it's really been a fantastic chatting with you. You're just a wealth of information, really, to be honest with you.
No, that's it. Just I suppose just that was the only thing that I felt I'd left out, just to say that I do also share my faith with them, so that, and I think it's important, because if I'm asking them, you know, and particularly perhaps those boys, you know, who aren't from a Catholic tradition, if I'm asking them about their faith and how they feel about whatever, you know, I think that giving of yourself, and as you said, that kind of vulnerability is important too.
Well, I think actually probably one last question, actually, sorry, Elaine, as I'll leave it be after that then, have you come across any useful resources or anything at all, Joe, that have been handy, you know, outside of the Grow and Love program, let's say, even have you found any that you'd even just flag? Or
No, do you know, I believe strongly in as many kind of visuals as we can do, as many kind of symbols, as many kind of videos, you know, things like that as we can kind of muster up. I couldn't give you a specific one now if you put a bullet to my head, but I think mainly, you know, just to invite them into that experience of something, changing the space, turning out the lights, putting on the candles, that kind of stuff, just kind of brings us into a different space when we're doing religion, and even, you know, things, presenting them with videos, you know, and again, there's so much out there, you know, that's helpful. Even we were doing lessons about kind of the natural world and creation and, you know, whatever else. Last year we went for a walk on this beautiful college campus, and we're kind of looking around at all these things and picking up the tiniest things and looking at, and these are, you know, 5th class boys, you know, and last year 11, 12, 13 years old, and they're like, look at the shape of this rock. Isn't that mad? Like, so just giving them kind of those kind of experiential things rather than that I could name for you a particular resource or a kind of a paper and pen thing, but the best resource I find is like, you know, a little video, a little clip, something from a movie, like an actual movie, like Spider-Man with great power comes great responsibility. The gospel today was about whom, you know, to whom much is given, much is expected. I'm like, it's Spider-Man, obviously. So, you know, using those kind of things and helping them to see how kind of pop culture, you know, that there's so many Christian messages there. There's also so many crap messages, but there's lots of, you know, so kind of trying to get a way in that way, I think, can be really powerful.
Brilliant. That's brilliant, Elaine. Thanks so much. And look, thanks so much for chatting with me today. And look, sure, hopefully we might be able to have a chat in the future again about maybe a different topic. Because there's so much more I think we haven't even got to cover today with you. But thanks so much. It's been really brilliant having you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks, David.